Last year, a buddy and I decided to go camping in the Coconino National Forest area in Arizona. We were both needing to escape the stress that had built up and to just immerse ourselves in nature for a while. Our plan was to stay for several days and take things easy. When we got there, we set up our camp near the lake so we could try out my new canoe. The first couple days went great. We were hiking and fishing and canoeing, and we were finally starting to decompress. On the third day, we were relaxing at the campsite after hiking in the morning. Suddenly, we both caught a whiff of something foul-smelling, like a garbage can on a hot day. Of course, we both started joking and accusing each other of being the guilty culprit. We laughed it off and figured it was just a passing smell. But about an hour later, I was fishing by the shoreline of the lake when I caught the same foul smell again. It was a lot stronger this time, and I couldn't ignore it. I looked around, trying to figure out where the smell was coming from, but I didn't see anything. It was unnaturally strong, though, and it was bothering me to not be able to identify it. I walked back to the campsite, and the smell stayed strong. We looked everywhere around the campsite, but we still came up empty-handed. As the day went on, the smell kept coming and going. Then when we were cooking dinner later, we started hearing something that sounded like someone chopping wood a couple hundred yards up the hill behind us. It went on for about 10 minutes, with intervals in between, and we couldn't help but feel a little unnerved by it. We wondered who would be chopping wood at this time of night when it was so dark. The thing is that the chopping was coming from a wooded area where there were no campsites. We kind of wanted to investigate, but we decided it probably wasn't the best idea to wander into the forest at night. The chopping sound eventually stopped completely, and then there was this really deep silence that seemed to hang in the air. We tried to shake it off and focus on cooking dinner, but we couldn't help feeling a little spooked by it. We eventually relaxed and were drinking and talking when suddenly we heard a deep, throaty bellow. The sound was so loud that it echoed through the hills above us and made us both stop talking immediately. I knew for a fact that there was no wildlife in Arizona that could make that kind of noise. We decided to move our tent and other camping gear right up to the shore of the lake. We figured that whatever was out there would have a harder time sneaking up on us from that direction at least. But we were feeling pretty nervous by then. We thought about packing up and heading for the truck, which was on the other side of the lake by the road we had driven in on. But it had taken us half an hour to walk into our campsite on the first day, and we didn't want to risk running into whatever had made that sound. We decided to stay put and keep a close eye out. We made sure to keep the fire going, thinking that might deter whatever it was. Probably about an hour after we'd heard the bellow, we heard the chopping wood sound again. But this time it was further away than the first time we heard it. It just didn't make sense. Then, about 10 minutes later, we heard footsteps coming toward us along the shoreline. We shone our flashlights in that direction, and we saw a guy and a girl heading toward us carrying a bunch of gear. When they got closer, we could see that they looked scared, and we asked if they had heard that strange bellowing sound. They said that they had and were too worried to stick around. We discussed our options and decided that it might be best if we banded together and hiked back to the forest road where our vehicles were parked. We packed up our gear and headed out, trying to look in every direction while we walked. The whole time we were walking to the road, that foul smell was in the air again. It was seriously overwhelming. As we were approaching the road, we heard a loud snap of a branch, and the girl started running ahead of us. Then about halfway between us and the girl, this giant thing stepped out of the trees. It was like a 7-foot-tall ape covered with dark, shaggy hair. It was huge and really buff with these huge shoulders and chest and no neck. It was probably only about 50 feet away from us. The girl had kept running and we couldn't even see her anymore. The three of us just stood there like morons, gaping at this thing. Then it let out a bellowing scream. It was like a jolt of adrenaline had shot through us, and we all just started sprinting up the road as fast as we could. We were gasping for breath, but we didn't stop until we reached our vehicles and drove the hell out of there. That thing was terrifying. You wouldn't believe how huge it was. No way in hell would I ever try to camp in that area again. I always wish we had a way to contact that couple so we could talk about what happened, because I'm sure it was a Bigfoot. But it seems if you mention Bigfoot to the uninitiated, they pretty much put you in the crazy box right away. Anyway, I'll be interested to hear if any of your listeners have had any weird experiences in that area. When I think back on this experience, it seems like something completely surreal that couldn't possibly have happened. But listening to some of the things I hear on this channel reminds me that I'm not crazy. I grew up in Kentucky on a horse breeding farm, so my love of horses runs deep. When I was out of high school, I knew that I wanted to pursue something that involved working with horses. A lot of my friends wanted to go into veterinary medicine, but that didn't sound right for me. I knew I wanted to work in more of an outdoor setting. I decided to take a year off before starting college, and while I was traveling around the country, I came across something that sounded perfect for me. I was visiting Yosemite National Park and found out that they had mounted park rangers. It sounded like a dream come true to ride horses around most of the day. I ended up taking the coursework to become a law enforcement ranger. And then eventually I was able to get a position at Yosemite as a mounted patrol ranger. Since I had extensive experience with horses, a big part of my job involved caring for them and training them. It was as great as I thought it would be. The horses are involved in a lot of different aspects of the park, especially law enforcement and search and rescue. Some of them are also used in educational programs. Also, visitors can hire some of them for backcountry riding. My days started really early, usually around 6 a.m. I would have to get there early to groom them and feed them. They would usually be looking out for me and expecting their measure of oats and their flakes of hay. A flake of hay is just what we call a portion of the bale. The portions are measured out so that we know how much they're getting. One morning I was half asleep and I went out to fling hay over the fences. I got surprised by the sound of geese flapping around the horse trough. I had never seen them over there before, so I wasn't expecting all of that honking and flapping first thing. I had to take a quick pause to gather myself while I kept tossing the hay. For the first time, I noticed the horses hadn't come toward me to get that hay that they were usually whinnying for. They were just staying huddled together under the shelter. I went over to the gate so that I could go inside and check on them. The gate latch had been getting rusty, so I had been securing it with a piece of wire. But I saw that the wire was missing, and the gate was open about an inch, as if something had gained access. That really had me worried because there was no way someone would have come out there earlier than me. I went over to the horses to give them some nose rubs, which they usually loved, but I could see that they were feeling nervous. I had brought the oats in with me and held some out in my hand, but the horses wouldn't touch it. Weirdly, the geese were still hanging out by the horse water trough. I couldn't understand what they were doing in the horse corral. I started feeling a little creeped out. I went back out of the gate and started looking around, and my eyes caught some movement. It looked like something detached itself from the landscape behind the stables. I saw this huge thing appear. It had a very large head that, I kid you not, reminded me of a dinosaur. No hair, just a big lizard-like head. It was standing on two legs. It turned toward me and looked right at me. It had reptilian yellow eyes. All I remember about its face were the eyes and the sharp teeth. Like I said, it was standing upright, and it was probably 6 or 7 feet tall. I was about 30 feet away from it, and it was hard to tell, but it looked like it had grayish, scaly skin. When it locked eyes on me, it reacted. It kind of shifted, or like took a little step to the side like it was surprised that I had seen it. This feeling of fear and dread washed over me, and it was paralyzing. I can still feel the feeling of my heart beating like crazy in my chest. I have never felt fear like that in my life since. I also felt a heaviness in my head. I don't know how to describe it in any other way. The thing felt like pure evil. After being immobilized by fear for what seemed like forever, but was probably only about 10 seconds, I turned and ran back to the horses. I would have run the hell away from there, but my first instinct was to protect the animals. As soon as I did that, it turned and ran up the hill behind it like it was nothing, faster than I have ever seen an animal move. I eventually sounded the alarm and some other rangers showed up. They wanted to follow after it on horseback, but the horses wouldn't go. I had never seen them disobey like that, and they wouldn't eat for hours after that. I cannot imagine what that thing wanted. It couldn't have been after oats and hay. When I thought about the possibility that it had gotten in the gate and gone near them, I just felt sick. But I looked them over really carefully, and they seemed physically unharmed. We started locking the horses inside the stable at night after that. Of course, when I went to make my report, they tried to get me to think I saw a mountain lion or something, but no effing way was that a normal creature. I've been a park ranger for 15 years. I worked most of that time in the ponderosa forests of Arizona, but a few years ago, I headed back up north. My family's from Twin Falls, Idaho. My parents are getting older, so I wanted to be closer to them so that I could check on them more often. I got a post at Craters of the Moon National Monument, and this time I took a research position, so I was moving into a pretty remote station. It was quite a distance from the nearest town, and then soon after I moved in, it seemed like a lot of things kept going wrong. The solar power was glitchy and wasn't working half the time. My sleep was suffering from weird disturbances. There were a lot of species of bats there, which was fine, but they kept getting into my cabin somehow. I kept getting awakened by flapping and squeaking, and no matter how much I looked, I couldn't figure out how they were getting in. I lived in the middle of juniper and scraggly pine and sagebrush, and for some reason that landscape gave me an eerie feeling. It felt so different from the southwest ponderosa forest that I was used to. About 2 months into the job, I started hearing sounds like something was walking and scratching on the deck at night. Sometimes it even sounded like it was scratching on the door. The area was known for its wood rats, so I chalked it up to that. Because you know how things can sound much larger than they are when scuttling around at night. But whenever I went to look, nothing was there. I assumed they scurried away when I opened the door. Then I started finding dismembered bats. Sometimes they were torn in half, but mostly I'd just find their wings on my deck. I've always been a relaxed person, so the fact that I was feeling so edgy was out of character for me. Whenever I'd leave the cabin at night, I had an eerie feeling like I was being watched. One night, I was getting back from my shopping run that I did once a week. While I was parking, this ominous feeling washed over me. At the time, I didn't have my shotgun in the vehicle, which would have made me feel safer. But since I had to, I got out of the truck. And that's when I was hit by this heavy smell. It was like a mix of mold and super concentrated urine. I went around to the passenger side to get my groceries. I looked to the left of the cabin, and I kid you not, I saw 2 glowing eyes about 50 feet from my front door. They looked to be about 5 or 6 feet in the air. I was freaked out, to say the least. I started yelling, "Get the hell out of here," but the eyes just crouched lower down. I assumed it might be a bobcat or a mountain lion, but I wouldn't normally associate that scent with a big cat, so that seemed odd. I picked up and threw a piece of wood toward it, and it leaped back a bit, but it didn't make any sound. I then threw 3 or 4 more pieces at it, and it retreated a little further back. At this point, I abandoned the groceries and started fumbling with my keys. I made a mad dash for the front door and managed to get inside and get my shotgun. When I came out, the eyes looked a bit closer, but I was less adjusted to the darkness now and couldn't get a good look at it. It was out of range of the porch light. I didn't want to shoot if I didn't have to. I held the shotgun and kept throwing pieces of wood from the wood pile on the porch with one hand. Finally, I could faintly see it walking away into the brush. I waited for a good 10 or 15 minutes before I rushed to get my groceries and get back inside. I eventually calmed down enough to make dinner, although my mind was totally on what had just happened, and I don't even remember cooking that night. I also kept the shotgun right beside me. I couldn't figure out what was attracting this thing to me. A couple hours later, I was sitting at the table reading and I heard that scratching sound again. This time I also heard this low, growling sound. By then I was feeling like a nervous wreck. It felt like the thing was stalking me, wanted something from me. I went to the window and raised the blinds about an inch and looked out. I assume it saw the movement because when I looked out, it had its back to me and was heading off the deck. I just froze when I saw a monster over 7 feet tall, walking on 2 legs. It wasn't a feline, that's for sure. It looked like an upright canine creature with a humped back and massive shoulders. The legs almost looked human but were huge, and the knees bent in a way that didn't look normal. I was just shocked at the size. When it got about 20 feet away, it turned around and I saw the face of a demonic-looking wolf. I was shaking so badly, but I managed to open the window a crack and watched as the creature ran off into the darkness like a rocket. I've never seen something that big move that fast. I've never been so scared in my life. My mind had no reference point for an animal like that. I slept on the couch that night. I'm sure I woke up at least every hour thinking I heard something. In the morning, a trail crew came up and we found huge tracks on the porch and leading away from the cabin. Huge canine tracks with long claws. After that night, I always thought I heard scratching on the deck, but never found tracks. I was afraid I was losing it. As soon as possible, I got transferred to the main guard station where I could be around coworkers a lot of the time. But eventually, I convinced my parents to move to Arizona, and I went back to the park I was familiar with. I just couldn't take that kind of stress. I used to play ghost games when we were kids growing up in Iowa. I'm in my early 40s now, but I never really believed in them until I actually saw one for myself. I used to have a job at the local movie theater when I would be home from college for the summer. A few of my friends and I worked as the morning cleaners. It was a fairly big building with 3 big screens, 4 mid-sized screens, and 3 small screens. My job was to clean all the screening rooms. My shift went from 4 a.m. to 10 a.m. It would take me about 20 minutes to get to work from where I lived. The theater was out in a busier area of town, and I lived on the outskirts. The first couple of weeks that I worked there, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Typically, there would only be 2 or 3 of us working during a shift. Most of the time I was alone, just cleaning and listening to my iPod. Sometimes we'd meet up with the day shift when they arrived and give them details on any maintenance issues and stuff that we were dealing with or lost and found stuff that had been left behind. One day in particular, my manager asked me if we'd ever noticed the front doors being unlocked when we arrived in the morning. I told him I had never noticed that. He also mentioned to us that some customers had complained about a tall, lanky man in a suit that had been following them from theater to theater and sometimes into the bathroom. A few times, people had come to the ticket area really frightened because of it. They would describe a man almost 7 feet tall wearing a black suit, and they always said he was wearing one of those old-fashioned bowler caps. Apparently, he would walk after them slowly, like he was stalking them, and they said he seemed threatening. But whenever a theater employee went to check it out, there was no sign of him. A few times, the police were even called. It became so common that business started to suffer. Everyone just referred to him as the tall man. Occasionally, an employee would catch a glimpse of him sneaking into a theater, but whenever they pursued him, the theater would turn out to be empty. So there were 10 theater rooms total, but Theater 5 seemed to be the one where the tall man was most often seen. Nobody wanted to clean out Theater 5. When I first started, I was fairly naive about ghosts and spirits, and I didn't feel that apprehensive about them, so they kept assigning me to be the one to clean it out. Theater 5 was in a unique spot since it sat behind the bathrooms in the lobby. In order to get to it, you had to walk down a long hallway before reaching the screening room. Being that far back made you the most secluded, especially when it was 4 a.m. and the only other people were on the other side of the building. It was strange. People cleaning there would complain of nosebleeds, constant headaches, and a feeling of being watched. Usually in the morning, if you were the first to arrive, it was your job to walk up into the projector rooms and turn on the lights in all the theaters. It was an easy job, but the top floor with the projectors had a lot of life-size cutouts of movie characters and massive posters, and in the dark, it could be a little creepy. I had done this several times before, and since I was the first to arrive, I went about turning the lights on. The projector area itself was dark. We would usually carry a flashlight with us while going around flipping switches. I was walking through the dark hallway of projectors, flipping everything on. I had forgotten my iPod, and I was whistling "Don't Worry, Be Happy" to myself as I walked down the corridor. I started getting that feeling of being watched again. I looked out several yards away, and in the area with the projectors overlooking the IMAX theater rooms, something was staring back at me. I stopped whistling and tried to focus my eyes. I knew it must be one of the cardboard cutouts. They were everywhere, so I kind of dismissed it and was about to flip the next switch when the cutout moved and I froze. It was a figure hunched over. It was whistling the tune I had been whistling. It was imitating me, but it was doing it much slower. That really creeped me out. My heart started pounding. It rose up from its crouch until it was standing at least 7 feet tall. It was a man. All I could see was a silhouette against the red exit sign lights and some of the projector computer monitors. It started coming toward me and kept whistling really slowly. I wanted to move, but for some reason my feet were cemented to the floor and my mouth had gotten so dry I couldn't scream. I didn't know what to do. It was definitely the tall man. He took some steps toward me. He walked crookedly like he had a bit of a limp in his left leg. It was like a nightmare with that guy limping toward me. He had taken about 3 or 4 steps toward me when suddenly he rushed at me, and I felt ice cold like he went right through me. Then he was gone. I turned around and ran down the steps and found my boss and the rest of the crew. I told them what had happened, and thank God they believed me after all the reports they had heard. They all tried to reassure me and say that he had never been known to hurt anyone. Probably just enjoyed spooking people. I didn't care, though. That experience alone was enough to make me put in my 2 weeks' notice. It was way too creepy for me. It's been 14 years, and I still recall that night as clear as day. My parents think I was sleepwalking and don't believe it was real, but let me know what you think. So, my parents were big into hiking long trails, and we used to go to every state park we could for vacation when I was a kid. I was around 10 years old at the time, and curious as ever. I was never allowed to, but sometimes I wanted to go off trail and explore on my own. I guess growing up hiking, I wasn't afraid of venturing off. On this particular day, we hunkered down for the evening once nighttime started approaching. We were all exhausted, so by the time we got into our tent, we fell asleep almost instantly. I remember waking up in the middle of the night and having to go to the bathroom really bad. I didn't feel like waking either one of my parents to let them know. I thought I'll be quick, so I figured there was really no need to. I went about 20 feet away from camp to relieve myself. After using a bit of hand sanitizer that we always left hanging on a tree near our campsite, I just looked up at the starry night. It was cool and breezy, and you could hear the coos of all the nightlife in the forest. It felt so nice out I didn't want to go back to the tent just yet. After all, I was 10 and full of life and curiosity. I decided to venture around a little bit, just me and my flashlight. Nearby, I discovered a little river with some fallen trees. I sat down on a log and just sucked in the fresh night air. But not too long after I heard footsteps crunching on leaves behind me. I stood up turning to look, thinking my parents must have noticed I was gone and came looking for me. I knew I was in for it, and that they would be mad. But when I flashed my light in that direction, I was greeted by a park ranger. I don't know why, but I felt safe in his presence, even thought it was weird that he'd be walking about at this time of night. "You out exploring, little fellow?" he said to me. I replied back, "Yes, I'm out exploring. He chuckled and sat down just below me, along the riverbank. Yeah, I've been exploring out here for a while now myself, he responded. I remember looking at his uniform and thinking it looked different from uniforms I've seen other park rangers wear. Instead of khaki shorts and a polo t-shirt, he was wearing white pants with high top, scuffed up black boots. I had asked him if the uniform he was wearing was a new one because I never saw one like it. He responded that they were standard issued clothes, but he told me they didn't keep him that warm. He proceeded to show me his long, dingy wool coat and said that was the only warm article of clothing he had. I was only in my pajamas and a short-sleeved t-shirt and was shivering a bit. He walked over and wrapped his coat around me and said, "Here, fella, this ought to do the trick." He was right. The coat warmed me right up. We talked a little more, and as curious as I was, I kept badgering him with question after question. The more we conversed, the more I realized how different his accent was, like he wasn't from the area. I asked him if he was camping nearby with his family, and he had said he was out with his army. I remember thinking why there is an army in the woods. When I questioned him about it, he seemed lost as to why they were even in the area. Certain questions seemed to stump him, like he lost his train of thought. He explained they were going to battle the British for their freedom. And at 10 years old, I figured it was grown-up stuff that was going on and I didn't know about it. He had mentioned George Washington and immediately light bulbs went off, and I blurted out saying I know who that is, and recently learned about him in my history class. He chuckled saying, "Yep, that's our commander, and he gives orders on where to go." I looked at him puzzled and said, "I thought he died a long time ago." To which he replied, "No, he's still very much alive." Being a kid, if a grown-up tells you one thing most of the time, they're right, so I brushed it off, assuming I heard wrong in school. I heard splashing in the water and flashed my light on it, seeing fishing jumping up from the river. The man gasped in awe. "What kind of lantern is that?" I giggled, saying it was just a flashlight, and handed it to him. He reluctantly took it and examined it. I showed him the switch to turn it on and off, and he was just baffled. "How do you kill the flame and reignite it so quickly?" he asked. I explained it wasn't a flame, and it was powered by batteries. I looked at him puzzled and asked if he had ever seen one before. He shook his head while still examining it and clicked the switch on and off. I told him he could have it since I had another one back at camp. "That's mighty kind of you," he replied. "Why don't I trade you for it instead?" he said. He stood and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, shiny, painted soldier figurine. My eyes lit up as he handed it to me. He smiled and sighed, standing back up. "All right, I best be on my way back to camp," he said. I stood up with him. "Yeah, I should go back too." I took off the coat he had put on me. "Here, you'll need this to keep warm," I said. He nodded and slid it on before reaching his hand out to shake mine. I put the figurine in my pocket and I shook his hand. He began walking off and turned back. "If you see any lads dressed like me, let them know camp's just up the mountain." I nodded and watched him vanish into the woods. I made my way back to the tent and went to sleep. The next morning when I woke up, I remembered the figurine he gave me and searched my pockets for it. I looked everywhere and couldn't find it. I was so bummed because I wanted to show my friends when I went back to school. A few years went by and I finally pieced together the outfit the man was wearing was one of a soldier during the Revolutionary War. I couldn't believe my 10-year-old self had a talk with a ghost from then. I never told anyone about that night, but I recall it so clearly and how real he seemed. I wished I had met him when I was older, because I would have had so many questions to ask. I've returned to that same spot we camped at in hopes of seeing him at night by that riverside. You hear that kids can see the dead, and maybe that's that. He could still be here, but since I'm older, I'm not able to see him. If I have kids one day, I may take them to that spot in hopes they meet the wondrous ghost I met.